Welcome to Varn Blog, and today we're talking with regular guest Erika Whelan on the legacy of left communism. And maybe that's a slight misnomer, although we will be talking about that more directly in a Patreon segment right after this one. But we're going to be talking today mostly about the history, the definition, the differences between left communism and other left oppositional forms, the history maybe of the spectrum, what we call the socialist spectrum, because I know when a lot of people hear us say stuff like left communist, left oppositionist, right oppositionist, the socialist right, they can get confused, and it's partly, I think, because a lot of these terms have been way watered down. I mean, I know that like you tend to be even stricter on your definitions about left communism than me, but that term, to the people who know what it means, has a very specific meaning, and to the people who don't know what it means, I hear it be like, ultra leftist being applied to like MMTers who are also police abolitionists or something. So, and usually ultra leftist and left communist, well, not exactly the same. The tradition kind of forms with the accusation of ultra leftism. So if you would like to define for our audience, what is left communism?
So there's basically, I guess, a couple of different ways of approaching that question. One, I guess, is sort of like an etymological approach, but that also kind of dovetails with the more empirical approach, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it. So etymologically, the concept of left communism or left-wing communism comes from the infamous pamphlet from Lenin called Left Wing, popularly known in English as Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. Lenin writes
what is the title in Russian? I mean,
so in the original Russian title more accurately translates as the childhood disease of leftism in communism.
Okay.
The English translation, the common English title, was a distortion of the original Russian translation. I'm not 100% sure when the pamphlet came out in English. So I have in the past claimed that it was a distortion by Stalinists. I don't remember off the top of my head when the pamphlet actually appeared in English, but definitely the common English title is a bit of a mistranslation. So what Lenin was referring to was not some kind of psychological regression, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it, this sort of Freudian concept of infantilism, to where people like who have reached a certain level of age, a certain level of emotional maturity in general, sort of regress to a kind of like early childhood state level of emotional maturity. That's not what Lenin was talking about. What Lenin was referring to, Lenin had something more along the lines of, diseases that afflict children that you eventually survive and become immune to as you grow. And particularly what Lenin had in mind was opposition. The main thing that Lenin was calling out in that pamphlet was opposition to participation in bourgeois parliaments.
Right.
Lenin was very insistent that it was necessary for communists to participate in bourgeois electoral politics.
Which ironically makes some of the current Marxist-Leninists who are abstentionists somewhat
Yeah.
like like uh like that's a position that I've seen, although I think it's not as big as it even was 4 years ago amongst the ML crowd. But they had effectively adopted a position that they would have been criticized in an infantile disorder to I mean, basically, it would have been an ultra left position, and it's. I think that book is infamous. It's also interesting in who gets linked in it.
Right.
A lot of people, like when you ask, like almost even Bordiga consider, for example, the Panakokian and Otto-Rulian Council Communists, the Dutch and German tradition, to be in the left com tradition. But if you ask them what they shared with the Bordigists and the Italian left communist tradition,
almost nothing.
Yeah, the assumptions are just like, yeah, they're not there. The only thing that they shared was a historical opposition to the Comintern, and that was way after.
Right. Well, abstentionism is the abstentionism is the single uniting or common, I should say, is the single common thread and the various tendencies that get called left communism, except in Russia.
Right. I was about to say, because, like, for example, one of my favorite Bolsheviks, Bukharin, was, I mean, is interestingly, because we remember him as a right oppositionist, but until 1921, he was basically one of the leaders of the pre-Trotsky left opposition.
Right.
With Radek, and wrote a review of State and Revolution and Communist Volume 1, which there was only one volume of, to remind Lenin of what he said in State and Revolution effectively. Right. And I find it interesting because a lot of people accuse positions that are actually clearly stated in State and Revolution of being ultra leftist or left communist. And it's also interesting about who gets cited in that book positively. For example, even though everyone right now, because of the work of Lars Lee, talks about how there's a continuity between Kautsky and Lenin, and in many ways there is, but there's also some big differences. One of which comes up in State and Revolution when Lenin sides with Pannekoek, of all people, and Luxembourg over Kautsky on the nature of the state. So I think, us discussing the origins here is interesting because we already see that when we talk about a lot of groups now, ultra leftism or even Bordigism, which I think is associated because of the influence of Duvet and Camet and French post Bordigist, with communization theory and with total abstention from unions and with total abstention from national liberation, which are positions that even Bordiga at his most retransigent did not hold. So so we kind of agree then that the concept of left communism sort of doesn't have that much meaning anymore, except around a vague nebulous of abstentionism from bourgeois electoral politics.
I mean, realistically, no, because the notion of left communism really only has any meaning. Like, it only has, how do I put this? It's mostly a historical legacy of adherence to traditions that originate in the left wing of the Comintern.
Of the second, which Comintern? Let's be clear here. I guess the third international is the Comintern, right?
Yeah, the third international is the Comintern, the Communist International, as opposed to the Second International, which I don't know that it really called itself anything other than just the International. I guess you might call it the Socialist International, but that word is now associated with a different organization.
Gross.
I believe that comes out of the 2.5. What we now call the Socialist International came out of the 2.5 International, which was an attempt by the center of the Second International to regroup in the wake of the dissolution after the war.
Is that so? That's not the conference that Hilferding ran in exile. It's something else.
I'm not sure.
Okay. So I think one of the things that confuses people the most while you're looking that up, I'm going to ask you, is a lot of people can't tell the difference between non-Marxist forms of communism, which would be like anarcho-collectivist, anarcho-communist. That's about it. I don't know that I would consider syndicalist anarcho-communist now that I think about it. I almost said syndicalist, but I don't think that's true. And these kind of terms, they get lumped in, as does the left opposition, which is like the Trotsky-Zinoviev groupings out of the Bolsheviks.
I'm sorry?
I was saying that, like, one of the things that confuses people about this is the distinction between left com and left oppositionists. So like the Zinoviev, Kamenev, Trotsky, obviously, thing, because even someone like Duvet in France, in one of his early essays, which he later revises, that was in the Rising Eclipse of the Communist Movement, he includes Trotsky in his communist left and then revises it later and removes Trotsky. And I remember when there were Facebook groups about like left communism and quote anti-tankism, there was debates over whether or not to include groups that were historically aligned with the left opposition.
Okay. Yes, Hilferding was affiliated with the 2.5 International via his membership with the USPD.
Okay.
The Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany.
Right. So those were the people who split over the war bonds issue, but still abstained and allowed it to pass.
Yes.
In the infamous 1914 debacle. And so they must be part of the Prague conference. Anyway, it makes sense. Okay.
So the left opposition was a grouping within the Bolshevik Party, mostly centered around Trotsky. The problem,
at least after 1919, it's centered around Trotsky, right? Like,
yeah. The problem with I don't know that the left opposition really came into existence until after Lenin's death, but I could be mistaken about that.
It didn't formally exist, obviously, but because how can you oppose the center line if it hasn't been established yet? But it's confusing the way we talk about this, because there's also this, we also talk about the left Bolsheviks who strongly overlap with the left opposition from like 1917 to like 1921.
Right.
But they're not the same.
No. So the left opposition was a loose coalition of really what the left opposition was a loose coalition of senior Bolsheviks centered around Trotsky. Trotsky was the main figure, the central figure of the left opposition. And what the left opposition was a faction that formed after Lenin is forced to retire from active participation in party work due to his health. And so the absence of Lenin creates a kind of power vacuum, because unfortunately Lenin had partly through his own actions and partly because of who he was and the central role that he played in defining the party program. And I'm not saying this so Lenin himself, through force of personality, did ultimately, to a large extent, impose himself on the party. Mm-hmm. To an extent, that was because he had it was largely because he was the one with a lot of the right positions. But also, it was because he was willing to impose his personality on the party. So, as when Lenin has to retire due to his health issues, essentially a power struggle erupts within the party. One of the other things was that Lenin was also working to keep these power struggles between the various senior figures within the party from breaking out into the kind of open conflict that we end up seeing as into the 20s and 30s. So you have Trotsky on one side. On the other side, you have Bukharin and Rykov. So Bukharin and Rykov are what get called the right opposition. Stalin, ironically, is considered the center. Mm-hmm. So you have various people aligning themselves with these various factions at various times. Trotsky always on the left, opposed to the right, willing to work with Stalin to oppose the right. In fact, Deutscher, I believe, is the sort of like paraphrases Trotsky's position as with Bukharin against Stalin, never with Stalin against Bukharin, or with Stalin against Bukharin, yes. Against Stalin with Bukharin, never.
Yeah, this becomes ironic in my mind during the fascist period, because if you'd have taken the rightist opposition and the Trotskyist understanding of fascism and put them together, you'd have had something kind of close to what fascism actually was. But since they hated each other going even more than they hated Stalin, that was not possible. Right. So, but to get back to the key point, Bordigism, unfortunately, has been, I think, revived under a bunch of weird and kind of completely misguided context. And only recently have there been decent books put out of some of the translations of some of the less commonly circulated Bordigist pamphlets, etc. Although it wasn't hard to find this stuff online. It's just there was no like official, nice printed up volume in English. A lot of the stuff that I worked with when I was first working with Bordiga was like English translations of French translations of Italian stuff, and I was actually confused. I was like, "Who? Italian's not hard. Like, why is anyone translating this directly from Italian?" But the repopularization of Bordiga in the English-speaking world, I do kind of link to like communization theory and the interest in Jacques Camus. Jacques Camus. But you can tell me what you think, because I know the Bordiga's tendency is the one that you care about more.
Okay. I mean, I don't know. I know that my exposure to Bordiga was largely because of you. And like my entree into the communist left was a result of me finding you on Facebook circa 2010.
Yeah, that was me reading the Bordiga's Current, the Dutch and German books that I think the Dutch and German one is now available by Haymarket.
Okay.
And getting obsessed with like trying to figure out the actual parameters, because people would throw around left communists. When I was abroad, occasionally I meet people in Mexico or in Japan who had like some knowledge of like the ICC and the ICT, the International Communist Current, the International Communist Tendency, and then Endnotes Volume 1. And then PM Press's publications of the Tripoline Duvet stuff in English, all were kind of in the circulation on the internet at the time, often traveling with Monsieur Dupont's Nilecom book. Like this was all a heady mixture of kind of the back end of the internet 10 years ago. And I found Bordiga the most fascinating because he was the hardest to understand about the way he was portrayed. Someone who was hyper centralist, but stood up to Stalin on organic, on equal representation within the party reasons. Someone who was had an absolute invariant program, but also believed that you couldn't kick other kinds of communists out of the coalition of the party, that like you had to dialectically work it out within the party, not by purging groups that were inconvenient. And I've known some people to read later Bordiga's turning against that position because of invariance, but the International Communist Party still seems to hold to both those lines. So,
I think I think a lot of it is because of the Bordiga does reassess his position beginning after World War II, like in the 50s. So he does reassess a lot of his positions, but I think people, because of the changed context, the world historic defeat of the communist movement and the destruction of Europe by the fascists and by the bourgeois forces of bourgeois democracy, and the cementation of the Stalinist dictatorship in the Soviet Union. The situation in the 50s is completely different from the situation in the 20s and 30s. And Bordiga is trying to work out what the correct approach was in this new situation in a world that was much more hostile to a genuine principled communist movement than anything that anybody had seen before the war. It's really hard for people, I think, who don't have a good appreciation for what things were like in the 20s and 30s. Even though the revolution had been defeated, the Stalinist counter-revolution had taken over the Soviet Union. A lot of people who were associated with the communist movement were still around, and the proletariat, particularly in Europe, still was putting up a pretty significant struggle. And then you have the rise of fascism, which really brings a lot of the proletarian struggle to heel. And then the war, in which Europe is literally bombed flat, and millions of proletarians are slaughtered on the battlefields of Europe and Africa and in Asia. So you have nuclear weapons, you have all kinds of advanced military technology. It's a very different world after World War II. The political situation is completely different. The economic situation is very different. Bordiga is trying to work out what the approach needs to be at this point. And I mean, one of the things is that the Comintern doesn't exist anymore. That gets dissolved by Stalin and replaced by the Common Form. Even before the Comintern was dissolved, we see that it becomes an instrument of Soviet foreign policy. But and particularly in Italy, we see the Italian Communist Party become, basically a bourgeois democratic organization. It calls itself communist, but there's no real communism left in any of its program. And so there's no the movement as it existed before World War II and before the fascist takeover in Italy and Germany doesn't exist anymore. So it's essentially in a lot of ways a refoundation. And he's trying to rebuild what's left of the communist movement, and put it on the right track.
So I would ask a couple of things now. I mean, one of the things we talked about is in Lenin's definition of left communism and ultra leftism. The critique is mostly on total abstentionism from any participation in elections. And people do need to remember that the participation in elections question was actually hard settled by the Bolsheviks over Lenin shifting positions over time himself, for reasons that were tactical more than substantive, but it was very much a thing. I mean, Stalin, for example, would have held at certain points in his life similar positions to what the left communists were accused of, actually, as far as participation in elections in Georgia. But that aside, they do get linked together. There have been many attempts to, particularly after 1968, for reasons that I don't entirely understand, how the French theaters and the Apparismo would have led to this idea of a reunification of cancel communism and Bordigism, because they never really were organically together. But let's talk about the positions that Bordigists generally hold. So what would you say makes a Bordigist Leninist, and this is one thing that people need to realize, Bordigists are the Leninist in the left communist tradition. What makes them different, or what makes them different from both other left communists and from, standard issue center Marxism?
Well, I mean, a lot of that is pretty specific to who we're talking about, obviously. And I should note that we don't really call ourselves Bordigists.
Right.
That's a label that other people have applied to us. In fact, it specifically kind of like was an appellation given to the given to the portion of the Internationalist Communist Party that went with Bordiga when the party split in 1953. Just a little bit of like quick historical context. Bordiga had actually dropped out of active participation in communist politics in the 30s because it was not safe for him to do so because the fascist government was watching him. And he'd actually been imprisoned with Gramsci for several years. He was allowed out. He drops out of politics for several years. After the war, he's convinced to come back. During this time, Honorato Damain and a bunch of other significant figures within the left wing of the Communist Party of Italy, which, by the way, I distinguish from the Italian Communist Party because the PCDI, which was the party that Bordiga helped found, dissolves itself or allows itself to be dissolved under Mussolini and then reforms in 1943 after the Allies occupy Italy and adopts a strategy of cooperation with the Allied occupation. So Damain didn't like what Bordiga, Damain, I mean, so also I want to clarify that although these individuals are significant, like we try to not really like these individuals were significant and they were important figures within the party. They are not the party. And particularly one of the in fact, sort of like this is a neat segue, is one of the significant distinguishing characteristics of the ICP from other other organizations is all work is the collective work of the party. We do not ascribe authorship to individuals. All of our work is the collective work of the party. Individual party members will obviously do work. Obviously it's not the entire party collaborating on a single document, but nevertheless, none of the work is really attributed to a single individual.
Right. Which has been a problem actually with some of Bordiga's later works, as far as like ascribing them to particular people, particularly when people like one of the most infamous ones is the Holocaust: The Great Alibi, which having read it really closely, does not say what people think it says.
Right.
And B, from textual analysis, does not actually seem to be written by Bordiga the man.
No, it was that was not Bordiga. I did not actually write that work. Auschwitz or The Great Alibi did not write that. It got attributed to him, but no, he was not, as far as I'm aware, directly or personally involved in writing that. But it is the work of the party. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, is as much his work as anyone else's.
So you also can't totally distance from it either because it was endorsed by the party, right?
Yes. So that's definitely one of the distinguishing factors. one of the other distinguishing factors is their conception of organic centralism. Within the party, decisions are not really made by voting. We understand the party's doctrine, and decisions are carried out with reference to the party's doctrine and program. There really isn't much of a need for a really formal decision-making process, because every member is expected to so every member is expected to do their best to do work in comport with the doctrine and program of the party. So we don't really need a lot of the kind of formal decision-making mechanisms that a lot of other organizations have, because comrades do work, and if that work is useful enough to the party that it warrants publishing, it'll get published. And if the work is, or whatever, if it's like a written work, whatever organizational work gets done, if the work is of value to the party, then that value will be recognized in the effect that it has on the ability of the party to do its work.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need to have, we have meetings where we'll present reports on various topics. We're always learning. And in fact, a lot of what Bordiga, the party, I really shouldn't say Bordiga, although this does come from a lot of the work that he did. Another thing is that we avoid activism. Mm-hmm. Going out on the streets and protesting is not really a very effective use of anyone's time or energy. I know it feels good. It's a way to let off steam, but the reality, I think you discussed this yourself, I believe, in one of your recent live streams, is it's not effective.
Yeah.
And particularly was it Dupont? Was that Monsieur Dupont who wrote activism? Or no, it was militant. Was it militancy, the highest form of alienation?
Yeah, that's not Dupont. That's somebody who's kind of post left communist.
Okay.
I'll look it up real fast. I used to know it off the top of my head, but I haven't thought about that text in a long time. It is by the organization.
Organisation des Jeunes Travailleurs Révolutionnaires. Organization of Young Revolutionary Workers.
Right, which I think is a like, the French left communists are hard to follow because there's a bajillion groups. Even by communist sectarian standards. But this is a text that gets shared around every so many years, though, because I believe it's from the 70s.
Yes.
And so it was something in that malaise after 68 that got passed around. Then I saw it a lot after I encountered it for the first time in English in a zine after the Battle for Seattle when I was like 19 or 20 years old, in an anarchist scene even. It wasn't even a Marxist thing. And then I saw it again being circulated off leftcom.com or .org, whatever,
leftcom.org.
Yeah, leftcom.org.
EICT.
Not leftcom.org, libcom. It was libcom.org.
Okay.
Yeah. Libcom.org. right after Occupy. So every time there was kind of one of these explosions and failures, I would see this text again. And it does kind of remind me of a lot of the stuff the DuPont say, but like more concise and less wild. But it's interesting. I think the other thing that's interesting to me about Bordiga historically is his agnosticism to outright antipathy towards the Popular Front. And that also often gets taken as antipathy towards anti-fascism. But I have to say that I find from the knowledge of the results of the Popular Front in Europe and the United States, I find that it's hard to deny that Bordiga at least had a point. Like,
with regards to anti-fascism, I know people commonly think that Duvet's formulation
it's Bordiga's and it's not.
It's Bordiga's, but it's not. That being anti-fascism was the worst product of fascism. Bordiga never uttered those words. That was Duvet. But it is expressing a sentiment, I think, that Bordiga probably would have seen merit in. I'm not going to say he would have agreed with it, but certainly I think Bordiga would have understood where Duvet was coming from with it. The Popular Front really turned out to be a disaster. But one of the other things that distinguishes us from other organizations is, so I think this is a really commonly misunderstood concept, and I understand why it's misunderstood, because the name lends itself to being misunderstood. That of invariance, invarianza. Yes, invariance literally does mean unchanging. Invariant does mean unchanging. The invariant body, the invariant body of party theses and the invariant program of the party. What we mean by invariance is not that we are unwilling to adapt to changing circumstances. That would be foolish and self-defeating. What we mean is that the program, the aims of the program do not change, and the position that the party takes with respect to the bourgeois movements and movements within the working class, in terms of its mission to guide the working class to its future as the masters of its own destiny, does not change. Invariance is a reaction to the extreme opportunism of the various mainstream Marxist organizations, both Trotskyist and Stalinist. Essentially, what we mean is that the doctrine of the party is not altered from political convenience. The doctrine of the party evolved. The doctrine of the party adapts itself organically to the circumstances in which the comrades are confronted, but it is always with the same aim of leading the revolution.
Right, and so there's a couple other things I think that need to be understood, and we'll talk about Councilism, which I think is more my deal than yours. But there are a bunch of hybrid groups, and so we do kind of have to talk about the hybrid groups.
In fact, classical German Dutch left is dead.
Yeah, it's gone.
There is no pure Councilism anymore. It's all synthetic. It's all synthesized now, because one of the historical differences, one of the two main historical differences between the Italian communist left and the German Dutch left were the Italian communist left accepted the need for a party, whereas the German and Dutch left rejected the party.
Mm-hmm.
The other difference was whereas the Italian communist left advocated working within trade unions, the German Dutch left rejected trade unions altogether and believed that you needed to form, which is why it gets called Councilism, because they thought that the task of communist militants should be to organize revolutionary factory councils.
Right.
But
like whole city councils too, like Soviets.
Yes. So yes, not just like in individual factories, in whole cities as well. But like the main thing here is that they are rejecting the excuse me. Essentially, they're rejecting the idea that there is a way to separate economic from political struggle at all.
Right. That's an illusion. Entirely.
I mean, yes, entirely. And that's a key thing. We recognize that economic struggle necessarily implicates political demands.
Right.
But economic struggle is not necessarily strictly political, in as much as it does not in and of itself need to challenge the relationship of worker to boss.
Right. So I just for people who are more familiar with more readily common left ideologies, they might hear about from like the radical end of the Wobblies, for example, the IWW. Mm-hmm. The difference between councilism and syndicalism is firm based, and it's about running your own business. It's not a co-op exactly; it's larger than that, but it's kind of it's like an extension of that concept. Whereas councilism just rejects the premise because social planning can't be separated out from political planning, from economic planning, that social planning altogether includes social reproduction and all this, and thus it has to be handled collectively in a collective politic. The Bordiga's critique of that, as Erika seems to be stating, and Erika, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's two. One we haven't mentioned yet, but the first one is that the absolute prefigurative collapse of economic and political is kind of, from the Bordiga standpoint, denying a bourgeois reality, and in that would be something that's also common actually to most Marxist traditions, that you can't go that far, that before the abolition of, or at least before the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's not doing that doesn't make sense. So that's one critique. The second critique, though, is something that I see people, even sort of neo-Kauts and sometimes even Stalinists, will buckle at, is the critique of that Bordiga make on councilism, is that it's too superficially democratic, and not that we should be less superficially democratic, more that democracy in and of itself is kind of a sham.
Yes.
And so the councilist concern about the form of workers' rule is misguided, because it opens itself up to a lot of the problems of democratic organization. That would be, yes. Yeah. Now you have groups that people are more familiar with as left communists, such as the ICC and ICT, the International Communist Current, the International Communist Tendency, which it took me forever to figure out how they were different from the classical and international communist movement under under the Bordiga regimes, because they were semi-councilist and they took the most extreme stances towards unions, towards not just activism, but towards pretty much everything. And the only thing that I had encountered other than them that were like that were like the Northite Trots who rejected unions altogether. And I guess there are some MLs who do too, but that's pretty rare.
The Northites have their own particular reason for rejecting unions.
Right. Which might be, if people know the history, might be more cynical than they realize. Whereas Bordigists talk about unions, like they often say the same things I do about unions, but like me, they still like, well, that's what you have to work with. Like, yes, there are limits on consciousness. Yes, they're corrupt. Yes, they're inherently tied into the capitalist apparatus. Like, that's all true. Yeah. But you don't have anything else. So.
Exactly. And I would, so a couple of yes, so that is absolutely correct. And going even beyond that is part of sort of, I guess, the reason why that's what we have to work with is, or this is sort of an overlap with sort of like both the reason why this is what we have to work with and part of the reason why, like, even if unions weren't the only thing that we had to work with, I guess, how am I put? So basically the issue is this. Unions are the main organ within which proletarians organize themselves to conduct struggle in the workplace. The union is historically, and I don't just mean in the past, I mean as a world historic fact, the elementary form of proletarian organization is the union. When people get together and struggle against their bosses for more money, better benefits, control over wages, control over working conditions, like if you look at, for example, the guidelines for a tax exemption as a labor organization and the Internal Revenue Codes, 26 USC 501c5. Labor organizations are like, one of the things that they struggle for is improvement of the product that the workers are producing. Higher wages, better benefits, like. And it's not, so this is why we say that there is an overlap with the political, in that, like, there is a certain political struggle in working together against your boss to get better wages, to increase the proportion of the value that you produce that you're recapturing, and also organization of work. The problem is that if people were at the level where these kinds of councils were something that would attract them, we would essentially be in a revolutionary situation already.
Right.
People, the subjective factors necessary for the working class to rise up in revolution aren't present. And that's because of the low level of organization. And you can't go to people who aren't even, who are so beaten down that they barely even have the will to fight for their own, like, immediate self-interest in, getting more pay and not being abused by their bosses so badly, to say, okay, fuck it, we're going to overthrow the government and start running things. Like, you have to organize people to struggle for these immediate, obvious, self-interest things, to teach them that they have the power, if they work together, to effectively challenge the power of the bosses. And as you develop the capacity for struggle within the class, then people start to recognize their ability. And it may be that the council is the form which the future proletarian, whatever the dictatorship of the proletariat, it may be that the council is the form around which the dictatorship of the proletariat were organized. The issue is that we don't, the councilists fixate on the council because that was the particular form taken by proletarian revolutionaries in the early late 19th and early 20th centuries. But, we're not there anymore. We don't, it's really difficult to say how things are actually going to go forward once we actually start to organize things. And, and this sort of segues into problems of democracy. So like Engels' famous letter on authority, where he's criticizing the anarchists who are complaining about authority, and the famous line of have these gentlemen ever seen a revolution? It's the most authoritarian thing imaginable, etc. But remember, before he goes there, he talks about the demands of running a power loom, and he just talks about the demands of running a textile plant that's putting out yarn being made from this raw cotton. Like, these machines operate on these machines are running all the time, and they need humans to tend them. We're going to have to work ourselves around the physical infrastructure that we have now. And as we move forward, once we're able to take control, we can talk about how we're going to reorganize things so that we don't necessarily need to have this dependence upon these great big factories. Because, Marx's famous formulation of communism is a free association of direct producers. Like, Marx was deliberately vague about what communism would look like, because he didn't want to. He recognized the failures of the utopian socialists in prescribing these particular systems, and so democracy is in many ways a sham. Both under bourgeois rule, because the bourgeoisie don't really share power with the proletariat. They give us the illusion of choice, but you've talked about how both parties in the United States are carrying out the same program, and we see something very similar even in parliamentary systems with proportional representation, where you have multiple parties who have to form a coalition government. None of these parties have ever been in a position to meaningfully challenge bourgeois rule, because the state can't do that. And democracy ultimately is, from the way we sort of look at it, it's really a kind of state form. Because if you look at what, everybody talks about democracy, and a lot of people have used it and tried to, use the word to mean things that don't really quite refer to the way a state is run. But then, you start getting into the problems of, well, what do you mean by social democracy or workers' democracy, or Because if you're talking about democracy, you're inevitably going to conjure up these associations with the democracy that we actually have. And ultimately, democracy has always been a class political formation. If even in ancient Greece and Athens, like, only a minority of the population were citizens of the polis.
Right.
The vast majority of the population of under the jurisdiction of the Athenian state had no say in the affairs of state.
Right. Right. Which is why, like, when you talk about like direct democracy, it's like it's a direct democracy of a very elite class. Not only are all women bracketed out and all slaves, all non-property owners are bracketed out. And so,
and not just non-property owners, but nobody living outside the walls of the polis.
Right. So if you're in one of the areas that fall under the hegemon of a particular polis, unless you're in the polis itself, you're not part of the ruling body. Right. I mean, it's something like 2% of the population or something like that is estimated to have been actually involved in direct democracy.
I don't know the figures, but that wouldn't surprise me.
Even more funny is it's also the shortest lived social formation that we know of. I mean, second to Soviet communism. In that it only lasted 2 generations, and I guess Soviet communism lasted 3.5. So like, it's interesting how much we talk about it, and yet, like, although, I mean, all that said, like, most communists think after the revolution things that would come out of Athenian democracy might be implemented, such as sortition as a way to stop the development of kind of classes, etc. And I know there's a game that a lot of people play now where they talk about, like, well, isn't surplus value really the definer of class? And I'm like, only if you think capitalism is literally the only class society that has ever existed, which would be very dumb.
Is surplus value related to what?
Isn't surplus value the only real definer of class? There have been many people who have told that to me directly lately.
Under capitalism, maybe, but
yeah. I was about to say it's the determining factor in capitalism, but like, are you telling me that feudal society was classless? That's wild,
right?
So it's I think it's a game people play to avoid some of the implications of the various social forms they want to implement. But one of the things that I've taken from not just Bordigism, even the smarter parts of the Frankfurt School, is you have to be very careful about a maximalist program being stated completely positively. Although Bordigists try harder to figure out what that would be. I know we're not supposed to call them Bordigists, but still, try harder to figure out what that would be than a lot of other kinds of socialists, because the people who often talk about like these like really strict transitional forms that really do try to abolish value in totality are Bordigists. They are councilists, like, council economists have actually worked out economic systems. Bordigists have tried to as well. They have different labor token schemes, this, that, and the other. Some of which I have posited are kind of dependent on technologies not being as advanced as they are now. And we could actually probably do better than that. But I know that Bordiga revised his position, for example, and this illustrates some of the misunderstanding about invariance on what labor tokens would look like, and even if we should use them. So I find that very interesting. But I often think that we do have to be careful about saying we know what everything's going to look like if we actually achieved a communist society now. I don't think we could even predict everything we'd have to deal with.
No, there's no possible way.
I mean, and I always point out, no capitalist thought they could do that when they were developing in the bourgeois, and like
Right.
even in the early bourgeois period, where like they didn't know what they were aiming to do.
No.
So
I mean, it took the bourgeoisie a couple hundred years to figure out how the. I mean, it took the bourgeoisie a couple hundred years to figure out how to finally put the feudal aristocracy in its place. Like even the earliest bourgeois revolutions in Italy and England, like in England, we had one generation of a bourgeois rule before they brought back the monarchy.
Yeah, and I mean England, even though it's the most advanced capitalist country, in that by advanced we mean longest standing, fully instantiated capitalist country, and it still has feudal elements that are bigger and more a bigger part of society than even most of Europe. Like,
and Italy didn't even like Italy was still rent by. I mean.
Sicily was manorial until the 20th century.
Right. like Sicily was manorial until the 20th century. Much of Italy was very agricultural until, even into the 20th century. And the various Italian states up until the Risorgimento were very, still very aristocratic. Like one of the distinguishing features of the Italian nobility, of course, was that unlike much of the rest of Europe, the Italian nobility had been urban for centuries. Like the Italian nobility moved into the cities,
right,
or never really left the cities, to be quite honest. Like,
yeah, because they were in Ravenna and Rome and stuff, kind of from the beginning,
right. They'd been there. The Italian aristocracy had been in those cities for centuries before the Lombards invaded.
Mm-hmm.
So, or but well before the Middle Ages. Like, classical civilization was an urban civilization, so they were already to a large extent in the cities. But anyway, that's a digression. So one of the other significant distinguishing features that separates the ICP from the ICT or the ICC is the doctrine of the unity of the party.
Mm-hmm.
There is a text that was put out back in the 70s, I think. The party does not arise from circles. So very briefly, since we're almost at, we're over an hour at this point. One of the differences between, I don't know about the ICC so much, although I believe, given their councilist background, that they're more federal than they're federalized, whereas the ICP is unitary. I know this is true of the ICT, is that the local organizations have a great deal of autonomy and are able to act fairly independently of their central apparatus. They maintain their own identities. So, like, we talk about the ICT, but the ICT is composed of the Communist Workers Organization and Battaglia Comunista, as well as a number of other, local organizations that have affiliated themselves with the ICT. You don't do that in the ICP. Everybody follows the instructions of the center. And while we do have geographic organization for the sake of coordinating work, we are not different organizations and do not produce any output that is not also that of our other geographic sections. We translate our material. Well, we will translate. We may not necessarily publish everything, for example, that we publish in Italian and English, or vice versa. But like, it still has to be in alignment with the doctrine of the party, and it still has to, and it's still published by the party. It is not published by like the North American section or the Italian section or whatever. Like, it's all the same organization. It's all the same communication. It's all the same line. We have to obviously take into account the particular circumstances that we're faced with when we're relating to people and when we're trying to deal with the, particular issues, but it's always with the goal of guiding things towards the unitary and invariant body party theses and the Unitarian invariant program of the party. It is unitary. It's all one. We all belong to the same organization. No part of the organization has any identity independent of the rest of the party. It is, and this is, we are in like, to put a different spin on when I mentioned militancy, highest stage of alienation, but to put a different spin on militancy, like, if we're militant has like associations with military, and the military is, at least in theory, a unitary organization. Everybody obeys the commands. The orders come from high command, and they go.
I will point out that that's actually not true in the United States, but yes, like.
Well, I mean, even in the United States, to a large extent, that's still the case.
It's the case for each branch, but we don't have a unitary military.
Okay, that's fair. But I mean, each individual. I mean, I don't think any military really has a completely unified. I don't know. I guess maybe even the PLA, like even the PLA, where the theoretically, or the former Soviet bloc countries, where theoretically everything was part of the same, everything was part of the army. The naval service and the Air Force still have their own command structure.
Yeah, go ahead.
And rank system. The very nature of running a navy requires a different set of rules and a different set of operational procedures from running an army or running an Air Force.
Yeah, one of the things I think is interesting about the Bordiga metaphor that ran from the 1920s and I think was not revised out was the organicness does not imply the organicness and the centralness is like a central nervous system. It does, however, not imply total identity. So like there's still different stuff going on. It's just that it's all part of a unified body that's operating towards one goal. It is to use a confusing term, but it's part of the Soviet debates because the USSR also in theory was set up this way. That it is teleologically centralized, like that it has one goal and it operates for them. Now in practice, I'm a believer that the USSR was not coherent in any way, but like it wasn't even state capitalist consistently, or at all in a lot of ways. I mean, it was in certain parts and not in others.
I think the best way to put it is that we are united toward a common purpose, but we are not a hive mind.
Right. You're not the Borg.
No.
So, I say this as a kind of because a lot of people have taken very uncharitable readings of Bordiga lately. I think partly because of the initial popularity 5, 6, 10 years ago. And some of these people, and I won't name names here, but used to call themselves Bordigists, who are now leading the charge in the opposite direction. I think I think that's quite interesting to deal with that. I also think when people were talking about the councilist movements, Root and Branch and the Palmatic Councilists are pretty much the American Council Communist are probably, ironically, the only thing you could claim to have anything like a line to the Dutch-German councilist tradition, and that's still kind of a stretch. Even though like Paul Maddock was friends with John Appel and Jan Appel, not John, Jan Appel. For those of you who don't follow this regularly and look at the commentary on the sidebar, Erika's normally the person pointing out that I mispronounce everything in every language.
Well, actually, I think you were. I think you were right.
The first time.
First time.
Yeah, it was John Appel. Then I was like, wait, no, that's
no. I think you were. No, actually, I think John might be right.
John Appel, yeah.
My knowledge of Dutch phonology is not as good as my knowledge of German.
French
phonology.
and German and
yeah.
Your German's better than mine, even though I lived there for a little while.
No, it is Jan. Okay.
Jan. Okay. So just I think that's interesting, but I also think that if you look in America, or even internationally, the councilist and even the Bordigists you tend to be fusionists. They tend to be council Bordigist fusionists, like the ICT, ICP, or they tend to be communizers who invoke Bordiga in ways I don't quite understand. Or even weirder, the parts of primitivism that claim some relation to historical Bordigism, which is a wild and varied history that has to do with why I use the term Team France. Because usually if something goes weird off of European ideology, it seems to come out of France. I don't really know why, but... like
I don't know, but yeah, the French just, I don't know, they have to put their unique spin on everything, and it frequently ends up fucking it up.
Right.
French brain rot.
It's hard for me to understand how someone who wrote about the abolition of town and country and the equal distribution to science of all peoples, across the world gets associated with primitivism. But
Kamat's primi turn is, I still don't understand what that was all about.
I think a lot of people got really hurt just before Mitterrand and just after Mitterrand happened. That's all I can say. That event, like, we always talk about like Biden derangement syndrome.
Yeah,
and Trump derangement syndrome. I think there really was a Mitterrand drives, like the French Communist Party goes insane, and everybody, like, Baudrillard happens, and I think Kamat really solidifies the strongest of their opinions, and
the thing is that Mitterrand doesn't come to power until well after Kamat's break. With the party,
right, but when does Kamat start writing about rewilding? Is that the 70s or the 80s?
He broke with the party in.
He broke with the parties in the early 70s, right? But I didn't think he wrote his primitivist text until like significantly after that.
Late 60s.
Okay, so he broke after 68.
No, actually, he
before
broke
68.
Before 68.
Oh, weird.
Yeah.
All right. And for those who don't know your really obscure communist history, Jacques Kamat's important because you could be studying anarcho-primitivism, he shows up. You study communization, he shows up. You study left communism, he shows up. He's like the mad scientist of the French ultra-left. Like, he's just there somewhere. And so he's interesting also because, like that article we were talking about militancy, he tends to show up ideologically after like an Occupy event goes sour, or people try to do the next big reformist thing and it goes belly up. That's when you see like people start reading Kamat again, and they start reading Stalin again, and they start reading whoever again. Like that's usually what happens. I almost am trying to develop like a psychological theory of this, of like the cycles of non-struggle.
That would be interesting.
or as I like to call it, the gust of popular lefty sentiment.
Yes.
But
actually is something that would be worthwhile, because that has baffled me for.
I feel like any theory I have for it is bong rip. It's bong rip, but it is consistent. Like the timing's actually pretty consistent. Like in relation, weirdly, to electoral events, not just like economic events. And so, like, you'll have like something like a recession, then you'll have something like an Occupy or a 68, and then like an electoral event are happening, and you can literally trace like 68 goes belly up, and what happens again? The anti-revisionist movement, and a renewed interest in like ultra left traditions emerges in France and in the United States, and a lot of that's even interpreted through Maoism and like weird forms of Maoism, or Mao Zedong thought, or Marxist Leninism, Maoism. Which, by the way, if you're in the deep end of Maoist circles beyond Twitterverse, those different terms actually signify different allegiances, which. I sometimes feel bad that like I was talking about, like all the Maoists I knew until like 2016 all hated China.
Yeah, but then suddenly the Dungists.
Yeah, then suddenly the Dungists won, and like everybody forgot everything they said for like decades. But a lot of those formations actually, not that they forgot, they just dissolved.
Right.
It's interesting how left communism has kind of survived. I mean, even though it's never ever been a dominant tendency. Like it's been the smallest of the small. But like, and I think it probably did see an uptick after Occupy, honestly, as far as people's popular interest. I don't think many people were joining the International Communists, but
no.
No.
But
not
here in the US anyway.
Right. But there was a lot of talk of it on Facebook, and then it was memeified to no end. And some people blame me as part of what did that. I'm gonna just point at the EndNotes people and say it was their fault. But it's interesting to think about how all this kind of bubbled up. But it hasn't died in the same way. These other formations will die pretty quickly. And one of the things about the current trends is while I think the IMT claims to be growing, and they may be in Canada and Europe, and the SWP I think is still technically the second largest left organization in Britain, but like it's been in rapid decline. We're seeing Trotskyist organizations, which seem to have been able to move zombie-like past 1992 for, I don't know, 2 decades now. They're finally beginning to start to really wither in a way that left communism kind of isn't. It's just been kind of there as a minority tendency. And we've seen ML renaissances come and go too. I mean, particularly in the 70s. So it's that I think that's interesting to just compare when people are talking about these tendencies, and yeah, we're back to everybody now uses ultra leftist and tanky as a slur, and nobody really knows. I mean, yes, some of us know what it means, but I mean, but I think Erika and I have both been called tankies in the recent resurrection of that
I've been,
historical
I've
slur.
been, I've been called a tanky, and I'm like, you do realize that I am like literally the opposite of a tanky, right? Like you keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means.
Right. So
People think it means like authoritarian leftist, which is like, what the fuck does that even mean?
no, it's a position
First of
related
all,
to the
first of
Comintern.
all, first of all, what does authoritarian even mean? Secondly, no, that's not what it means. Like, yeah. Although I blame myself partly for popularizing that. I blame myself in part for introducing tanky to audiences that did not understand what it meant, even though I tried to explain it. Like literally when I created Communism 101 Anti-Tank, like I explained in the group description what tanky meant.
Mm-hmm.
Like people don't read.
Yeah, well, I mean, duh. But it's so I want to encourage people, as the ultra leftist slur has been resurrected too, also like simultaneously with tanky and thrown around to the point of near meaninglessness. When we say left communism, when I say left communism, I'm referring to two things, and I might refer to one more thing that like Erika would reject actually, and that is the Trotskyist that over time took up positions identical to left communists, but were separate from them. I sometimes do like consider them left communist, although I actually understand why Erika would not. And I think the historical legacy is important because, like, other than abstentionism, it's hard to know what even unites all these tendencies other than some people in power didn't like you at one point. Because because you might go, oh, it's anti-Leninism. Well, no, not all these groups are anti-Leninist at all.
We actually look very favorably upon Lenin. Obviously I've said some things that were critical of him, so it's not like not like we worship the man as a god, but he was for better or for worse the kind of the central figure of the revolutionary movement wave of the 19 teens and 20s, and a lot of the Trots and Stalinists both recognize his pay homage to his importance as a theoretician and as a practitioner of revolutionary politics.
Right. I mean, even people who would try to get out of the Leninist bind by claiming Kautsky are really, most of them, if we look at what they advocate, they're actually more Lenin than Kautsky. It's just they're emphasizing the nicer parts of Lenin.
Right.
So
yeah, no, we the anti-Leninism in terms of Marxism is a feature of the German Dutch, primarily the German Dutch left,
right, and then it emerges like in other groups later, like,
and that's predicated on their rejection of the party and their hardcore abstentionism. Bordiga and the abstentionist fraction of the abstentionist fraction of the Communist International, like, we definitely did advocate for abstention, but when the Comintern said no, you need to participate in elections, we said, well, if that's what the Comintern has decided, we are going to obey the dictates of the Comintern because that's how discipline works. This is what centralism means.
Mhm.
There is a central authority that is given the right to issue instructions to the subordinate parts of the organization, and you can argue against those positions and try to explain why you think they're wrong, but at the end of the day you have to follow orders.
Right. And on that note, we're gonna take a 5-minute break, and those who are patrons, we're gonna we're not gonna take an hour and a half. We're gonna spend less time. Both Erika and I have a life. But we're gonna take a kind of commentary. It's gonna be like, how does a left communist respond to these current conditions? And I'm gonna ask Erika to kind of take a no stance. I don't want Erika. No one should take Erika as representing the left communist stance, because no individual can take that. But just talking about maybe some ways in which we might see why this is important in regards to things going on right now. So we're going to do that though off the free side. It's going to be the paywall side. And on that note, Erika, we'll see you in about 10 minutes.
And yeah, sure. And by the way, anybody who's interested in learning more about the International Communist Party, you can find us at www.international-communist-party.org.
Yep. All right. And so I'll be right back. So I have to thank a few patrons today. I got some Kargan El Khans are the highest level of patronage. These people sponsor individual shows, although they haven't sponsored one yet. And some of those shows, by the way, will be coming down the tracks. They're mostly for patrons only, though. So I have a Eugene Debs. I'm not sure which Eugene Debs. I've known many on the internet, but I have a support from Eugene, and I have a support from Stephen Killing. And I'd like to thank you for you becoming a con among cons. If you, I would also suggest, if you would like to check out any of these orgs, check out the Communist International, the ICP, and you may also look up the ICC, the ICT. Interestingly, with the latter two, there's a whole lot of like sniping at each other that goes on. Not to disparage anyone, but no one could claim that they are non-sectarian. Let's just leave it at that if you're checking that out. If you want to follow up, Erika is a semi-regular on the show, more on the Patreon side, is one of my many regular collaborators over there. And she will be back to talk about all kinds of stuff. We actually, the big thing we talk about usually is medieval history. So I hope you enjoyed it, and check it out. And I will continue my coverage of various tendencies in the future, so that people have a better grasp of what people actually believe. And if people say they believe something and don't actually articulate these things, maybe you should not trust their opinion as authoritative. Or maybe the tendencies change. Who knows? But that's where we're going. And so I'm going to take 10 minutes off. And for patrons, we'll be back in 10 minutes on the flip side to talk about more recent events. Take care.